You have been called back by the company you gave your full presentation to for a second visit. They've asked you to speak only about the ethical aspects of the problem and to explain why your solution successfully handles any ethical issue. You will have 10 minutes. There'll be no Q&A. You may not use slides or video. And you already have fulfilled having the 2 to 3 people that need to be there. Are there any questions about that? Okay. We are being recorded, and the reason for that is that for teams that come in the future who are interested in whether or not they can do the things that IBEC is asking of them, they can see videos like this and they can understand better how they might picture themselves in that situation. Does that make sense? So you're part of an educational process in addition to having, what you in fact have. The way this will work is I will be your board, but don't be put off that I'm not making a lot of eye contact. What I have to do in my 10 minutes is take down key things that you say, and any board would do that. So I'll do my best to be paying, to look like I'm someone that you're talking to. But my goal is to take down information that will hopefully be helpful in giving you feedback, because what will happen after each of you present, you'll each get feedback afterward at the end. And then you can ask, questions if you want to. The one caution that I have, it's great that you're all hearing each other, but several years ago, I was I was invited by a company to come and make my proposal. And they invited the other 2 people that they were considering as finalists too. So the 3 of us spent the day together listening to each other as we were making our respective presentations. And what I found is that, whoops, pardon me, I will have that off. What I found was that I was paying too much attention to what other people were saying, and I wasn't in my own game. And so I invite you all to not care about what's happening, because you can always listen to the video later if you choose to. But this is your game, and this is your company, and this is you being excited about being brought back. Doesn't matter what anyone else does. Is that fair? I can't think of anything else. So I will just simply remind you that it's only 10 minutes. I'm going to put my timer on, and you might want to have a timer for yourself. If by chance you are not done at 10 minutes, you're allowed to finish the sentence that you were in when the bell rings. Otherwise, it ends. Okay? All right. And congratulations for what you accomplished yesterday. That was a lot harder than today is going to be. So I welcome having an opportunity to hear. All right, is the same company ready? I can't see anybody saying yes or no, or.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the same company should unmute.
Thank you, ma'am. So
you're ready, and I'm going to now hit the timer to begin.
Thank you. So as you all know, we're the Sane & Company. We've been invited to help you, the Nestle board, consider initially the ethical, legal, and business implications of expanding your business in Cameroon. And we're really grateful you've invited us back to speak more to some of the particularly ethical issues regarding doing business in Cameroon and the nature of expanding into such a complicated region. So we just wanted to briefly thank you again for your time and participation, and just reiterate from our presentation yesterday that we understand there's a lot of very unique concerns about doing business in ungoverned or lightly governed countries, especially those with high rates of endemic poverty. So that we talked a lot about it, the legal and business concerns of being involved with potentially companies or contractors that could have associations with militias or terror organizations, be using child or forced labor, and similar concerns to that, in particular government corruption. But we'd also like to just reiterate, all these are deeply ethical concerns as well. No one wants to be involved in or aid or abet or fund or support lots of very bad activity that happens in countries with less than strong governments in regions where there's two ongoing widespread civil conflicts. So to speak to a little bit more about why we shouldn't just simply opt out of doing business in Cameroon is going to be Jackie.
Thank you, Jacob. So to start off, you're probably wondering, with all of these ethical concerns on the table, is it not risky for Nestle to do business in Cameroon whatsoever, right? It seems like there's a lot that could potentially go wrong, a lot of ethical concerns in the way, such as how do we navigate potential conflicts such as child labor, such as bribery that happens when importing and exporting goods. So again, considering these things, Nestle, you may think that it is a reputationally positive business endeavor, as well as the potential for ethical blunders to harm your reputation, and that therefore it may not be the best idea to invest in Cameroon. However, we recognize that these ethical concerns that you may be worried about harming your reputation originate from Cameroon's underdevelopment itself, and that this is the root problem. And so in pulling out of Cameroon, none of these issues would actually be resolved, but only proliferated. And it would pull away a rung of potential development that Nestle can have a very strong part in helping to see through. So we think that by pulling out of Cameroon, Nestle, really that action would only protect your business reputation. And the most ethical thing to do would not be to get away from these potential ethical concerns and get away from, would not be to do your best to avoid such issues that may arise in an underdeveloped country, but actually invest more in such an underdeveloped country and accept those potential risks to do a greater good and recognize that greater good that you have the ability to contribute to. Jacob, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Jackie. So again, we think it's important to frame the options of who else is going to be involved in Cameroon. So there were a lot of questions on our presentation yesterday about how much involvement does Nestle have in Cameroon versus other actors, because clearly nothing they do is in a vacuum. Other people are going to be interested in purchasing cocoa beans, whether or not Nestle is. Other people are going to be interested in selling agricultural products to Cameroonian consumers, whether or not Nestle is. And so we think it's important to frame the question by noting that not only does Nestle seem genuinely interested, both from the board's remarks yesterday and from earlier statements they made, especially in 2011 or with their recent forestry plan, in making genuine positive changes, but lots of actors aren't. So one factor has been the recent rise of Chinese state-backed firms in Cameroon using techniques like debt trap diplomacy, which put in place large burdensome debts for often unnecessary infrastructure projects that are going to almost exclusively be done by foreign workers and tend to cut off rungs of advancement and development for local Cameroonians rather than build them up, as, for example, Nestle's recent factory in Douala has offered. So Cameroon has other foreign multinationals increasingly looking at it with interest, albeit ones with a much shorter history of involvement there. In particular, there's a number of French financial firms that have been taking advantage of the relatively weak West African franc in selling and importing goods at lower than normal rates. And it's also worth pointing out that the state actors aren't always necessarily super strong. And there's, in fact, in a number of instances in Cameroon, competing regulatory and legal standards between government agents. So even though Nestle, again, runs real ethical risks of potentially being involved in real scandals, potentially aiding or abetting pretty bad actors, the alternatives to what Nestle's current involvement is, or Nestle's expanded future involvement, aren't necessarily particularly positive. I think it's also worth finally noting that lots of people will often look with concern with the role of multinational corporations in a country which much of the commerce is currently done by small and medium level organizations. And it is worth pointing out that while lots of these organizations have pretty powerful and compelling concerns about the well-being of the people they cater to, there's a lot of ways in which them being under-resourced compared to Nestle can have pretty dire economic and, more importantly, ethical consequences. So to talk about a couple of principles that can guide how Nestle can adhere to these stricter ethical norms, again, these were things we referenced primarily in terms of legal liability in our presentation yesterday, but we think there's a pretty hefty ethical weight. So those two key principles are the participation principle and the vulnerability veto. So the participation principle is the idea that the people who are affected by actions Nestle takes, so for example, local farmers, construction workers involved in the construction of factories and stuff like that, have a disproportionate amount of burden to bear when it comes to the consequences of Nestle's actions, and have unique insight to offer, and tend not to be incorporated into conventional decision-making processes. And this would be true for Nestle or any other actor, right? There's huge linguistic diversity in Cameroon. So if you have like a bunch of Fula speakers at a medium-sized organization who are having primarily Arabic-speaking construction workers, you have a huge risk of miscommunication. Oftentimes, it just comes from, genuinely hard to understand stuff. If you're building a farm here, are you going to destabilize the terrain around it and create an enhanced risk of mudslides? These are risks that are difficult to know. And part of our suggestions to Nestle yesterday that carry a lot of moral weight is the idea of you actually incorporate local partners into the decision-making process. Nestle already has 109,000 local farmers they're partnered with across West Africa. And to formalize and strengthen those connections in terms of having farmers' councils or representative bodies that can advise and suggest Nestle in how it can minimize the negative impacts its decisions have on farmers or their well-being is a great way to represent and aid the participation of people who are most affected by it. And then finally, on the vulnerability veto, is the idea of giving explicit vetoes. So this is the idea of an independent ombudsman that we referenced yesterday, is to create specific powers reserved for people who face the most disproportionate risk. For example, farmers at risk of mudslide, workers in more sped-through process when it comes to creating factories, allow them to have explicit ways to raise alarms when there is a kind of four-alarm fire situation going on. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jackie to talk a little bit about moving forward from Nestle's prior scandals.
Thank you, Jacob. So with all of these concerns being raised, we have to ask the question, when problems do arise, how can or should Nestle regain the trust that they need to be able to continue their mission efficiently? So we think that in asking that question specifically, there is a danger of optics, right? So we don't think that you, Nestle, should just aim to appear more trustworthy, and in doing so and taking actions to make sure that your reputation stays, not distrustworthy, that would actually undermine your capacity to actually do good and ensure an ethical change in the foundation of your company from the get-go. Instead, we think to regain trust, we should not be so focused on appearing trustworthy, but on actually focusing on how your efforts of your business will align with the needs of those that you have the potential to help. And instead viewing this as an opportunity to actually contribute something that is going to reflect the new values that your company wants to embrace. So we know that people like you, like the board, your employees and your investors want to be able to do good, because we've seen the policy changes you've made since 2011, since previous scandals. And we think that you really have the potential to be completely devoted to them. So we think that just continually having this frame of mind to not try to focus on the optical reputation that you will have, but instead just devoting your company to, yes, succeeding in business, but also making sure that those business interests align with the interests of the humans that you are employing and essentially investing in the lives in, will make your company the most ethical and essentially the most profitable. Additionally, when like you said, blunders do arise, because they will in the future. There will be questions that arise, questions that the ombudsman and administration must deal with. We think that public acknowledgement of wrongdoing would be a really good step. When we consider the components of an apology, we know that there should be an acknowledgement of a wrong that's been committed, an acceptance of responsibility, a promise to do good in the future, and an expression of regret. So we think that by incorporating those things into your procedure for when these issues do arise, and not just solely focus on PR, that that is going to be a way to realign your reputation with those of your consumers to be a trustworthy company. I'm going to pass it off to Jacob to conclude.
Excuse me, but the 10 minutes have been exceeded.
Oh, okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. And I will, I did not respond to much of what you said after 10 minutes. But I will definitely, I will definitely include everything else. Thank you very much. The same corporation, I appreciate all of your comments. And before we call up Fordham, I just want to remind everyone that you need to be watching your clock, because when a board brings you in, when they say 10 minutes, they stop listening after that because they are moving on. So it's not a big deal, but I just want to make sure that we stick to the kind of formalized approach that you would be subjected is an unkind word, you would be exposed to when you're in a situation like this. So thank you very much to both of you. And I will just take a minute to make sure that I have the thoughts that I need to have. So the Fordham Consulting Group can just give me a minute and we'll then start with them. All right. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much. And now will the Fordham Consulting Group join us and make their pitch. Pitch is the wrong word. Make their case.
Okay, thank you, Gail. We're going to go ahead and begin. So, good afternoon. My name is John Mason, and this is my partner, Michael Worley. We are here as representatives of the Fordham Consulting Group, who you, CEO Joseph Blount, has contracted to help navigate a critical inflection point. On May 7th, 2021, your private entity, Colonial Pipelines, reported that they were victims of a powerful ransomware attack. The attack was perpetrated by the Russian cybercriminal group DarkSide. The encrypted ransomware has inhibited vital operative systems and compromised Colonial Pipeline's billing system. As a result, CPC have been forced to shut down all 5,000 miles of company pipeline spanning from Texas to New Jersey. This has precipitated a complete cease in operation. Additionally, DarkSide has stolen 100 gigabytes of company data, which includes the military ID numbers, social security numbers, health insurance records, and bank routing numbers of your employees. They have threatened to release this information publicly if you do not meet the demands as follows. In exchange for the stolen data, ransomware decryption key, you must pay the dark side 75 Bitcoin, equating to roughly 4.4 million US dollars. You're within your legal right to pay this ransom. However, FBI guidelines do not support capitulation.
To review the ethically relevant financials, the shutdown in operations represents a potential daily loss of 3.5 million in revenues or a potential daily loss of 1.1 million in profits. The ransom payment represents only about 1.05% of annual profits. And furthermore, a shutdown would result in the same amount of loss to the company's bottom line as the ransom after about 4 days. We can assume that the shutdown would cause a shock to the oil market that would inevitably cause a substantial rise in the price of gas if the shutdown is not resolved quickly. This increase in gas prices will have a disproportionate impact on low-income Americans, defined as 200% the federal poverty line. So the disparity for those under the federal poverty line would be even greater. Low-income families could see as much as a 30% drop in their discretionary income from a 20% increase in gas prices. Any failure to restart operations as quickly as possible would have near immediate effects on the welfare and livelihoods of thousands of low-income families on the East Coast and across the country.
From an ethics perspective, the dilemma lies in the two possible solutions. You can choose to pay the ransom in the interest of protecting your stakeholders, but you do so under the assumption that your funds may be used for nefarious purposes and can foster future acts of maleficence toward other business owners. Alternatively, you can opt to not capitulate. Doing so strives to establish a strong ethical standard against the attackers, but does so with the knowledge that employee livelihood will be jeopardized and the welfare of millions of low-income Americans will suffer. We believe that the ethically superior choice is to pay the ransom. We acknowledge that a conscious contribution to criminal enterprise may be inherently unjust, and that the missions of evil and malintent may better thrive. However, a payment of $4.4 million would only make up a small fraction of the $600 million paid out to hackers up to date in the year 2021. We assert that the net damages ensued from failing to restore pipeline operations are far more salient and immediately pressing in regard to the millions of stakeholders who have vested interest in this situation and its outcomes. We believe that paying the ransom acts to immediately protect three major vulnerable interest groups. Firstly, by paying the ransom, Colonial Pipelines is acting to protect its shareholders. We've established through our financial analysis that the ransom payment is a near negligible cost to shareholders and strives to retain future earnings. This ensures that our shareholders are protected from significant monetary losses that may occur as a result of the attack. Why is this important? Because you are acting on the virtue of trust. You demonstrate that a commitment to benevolence and integrity in your relationships is the value that trust is commonly founded upon. Secondly, capitulation offers CPC the best chance of alleviating the threat that DarkSide has made to your employees. We assert that it is your ethical duty to fulfill promises of protection made to your valued employees when they were hired. By exercising this duty, you act against the wrongful nature of deceit and selfishness that many companies may take. Moreover, CPC demonstrates willingness to actively combat evil and malintent toward others. Lastly, and most importantly, we seek to satisfy the concerns of the general public. By working to prevent detrimental shocks to our economy, Colonial Pipelines is protecting the welfare of millions of Americans. Parents whose child's education is dependent on them getting to school in the morning. Hardworking breadwinners who require transportation to work, where they earn to provide necessary provisions for their families. And small business owners who rely on your contributions to the transportation infrastructure to conduct their business at a cost-efficient rate.
From a fiduciary standpoint, which is an ethical duty as much as it is a legal duty, it would be easy to defend the position of paying the ransom, as it acts to immediately protect all major stakeholders that John outlined. This includes protecting the financial interests of shareholders, the identity and personal data of employees, and the welfare of the general public. It's important to remember that not only are you the victim of this attack, but that there's no recourse at this point other than paying the ransom. Nothing can be done to remove DarkSide from the system or restart operations in a timely manner without the decryption key. There are, however, additional actions that can be taken to bolster the ethical position of paying the ransom.
Firstly, we want to further address the role of the employee. We understand that your employees may still feel a sense of vulnerability after payment, given that their data is now permanently possessed by an untrustworthy actor. We suggest that Colonial Pipelines establishes a credit monitoring program for its employees, which would help reconcile initial failures to protect their valuable information. You would also be sponsoring the long-term protection of vital human capital. We also suggest that Colonial Pipelines commits to continued cooperation with the FBI as you seek to recover lost funds and exact justice on the perpetrators. It is CPC's responsibility to fight the potential perpetuation of crime that may be fostered as a result of your payment. This supports the government in a losing battle against cybercrime and looks after other members of the business community who may be targeted in the future.
A potential downside of paying the ransom is the threat of double extortion. The hackers could simply refuse to give you the decryption key after you pay the ransom. This is unlikely, however, given past ransom attacks by this specific group and more broadly, but it still has to be considered. Given that the ransom is negligible to the firm monetarily, we see double extortion as a non-issue, as it simply removes the first option, paying the ransom, from the table, with the only loss being the $4.4 million and a small amount of time. At that point, there's no longer an ethical dilemma. The only option left is to do whatever you can to restart operations without the decryption key. We've explained why paying the ransom is the ethically superior option, but why is not paying the ransom ethically inferior? Not paying the ransom would likely result in the immediate release of the stolen data, potentially affecting the livelihoods through stolen identities, credit issues, and a litany of other difficult situations. The shareholders would lose substantial profits from an extended shutdown, and most importantly, the impact to the broader public would be devastating. Any material increase in the price of gas, which would be almost a certainty given an extended shutdown, would have disastrous implications on the welfare and economics of low-income Americans.
We believe that a decision to not capitulate as a sign of strength or lack of giving in does not show ethical superiority, but is rather derived from hubris and pride. While the funding of criminal enterprises is not in line with ethical standards, there exist tangible threats to the company's stakeholders. It is your responsibility as the CEO to negate the threats which stand immediately in front of you and virtuously protect those who have filed trust and dependency with the company. We recognize that no morally reprehensible act on behalf of Colonial Pipelines catalyzed these vicissitudes. But even as a victim, you have the option and power to actively prevent substantial amounts of certain harm.
Colonial Pipeline's mission is to move energy where it's needed. By paying the ransom, you are showing that CPC is committed to serving the American people and their mission, even when they are the victim of a brutal attack. Not only will this instill confidence and trust in your employees and shareholders, but it will do so for the whole of the American public.
We acknowledge that our recommendation has a strong probability of perpetuating crime, but given the alternative certainty of immediate hardships, specifically to low-income families and trusted employees, your decision must seek to alleviate threats already in fruition.
To boil it down, there's a gun to your head, and no one's going to find it morally reprehensible to give up your wallet to protect yourself and the interests of your family. Give up your wallet to DarkSide and protect your shareholders, employees, and the American public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ford Consulting Group. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes before we talk to the Manitoba group. Thanks. Thank you again, Fordham, and I welcome Vision Consulting.
Thank you. Just a second. All right, so can I just start whenever or?
Well, let's make sure we both have our clocks timed for 10. And I don't have mine yet, so
Okay.
allow me to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds good.
All right. Are you ready, Vision Consulting?
Yes, ready to go.
All right, go.
Good morning. I would like to thank you, the Executive Committee of Toyota Motor North America, for inviting our team at Vision Consulting back here today. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Denise, and joining me are my colleagues, Brian and Tristan, here to discuss your organization's ethical concerns. We know that what makes a company ethical is one that fully integrates ethics into its decision-making and acts with integrity. Your company has an inspiring code of conduct, which includes keeping the customer's perspective first, pursuing continuous improvement, and working with integrity. However, now it's time you need to live up to the standards and values you've set. Vehicular theft is a growing issue, and Toyota's vehicles have become a key target due to their high resale value and the ease of breaking into its push to start cars. This creates a problem for both the consumer and society, with theft costing North Americans approximately $8 to $10 billion per year. Still, you have yet to take any concrete action towards addressing the issue, while your competitors have stepped up. And failing to address the issue of theft is failing to uphold your stated principles of keeping the perspectives of your customers and stakeholders at the core of your organizational efforts. It also becomes a significant damaging issue when the senior management fails to live up to the codes of values they set, because over time, this erodes the employees' trust in the leadership and organization, leading to a disgruntled workforce. So, in order to begin living up to the standards and values set by your organization, we recommend you prioritize consumer well-being in all aspects of Toyota's business practices by shifting the culture in your organization, pushing innovation, and changing the auto industry. This renewal of purpose creates values for shareholders and other stakeholders. However, before we dive deeper into our proposed solution, let's look at Toyota's position concerning ethics.
Toyota's leadership is not putting ethics at the forefront of their agenda. Your company does what is legally required of them, but does not push to be proactive in any ethical way. This has brought attention to 3 ethical issues we have discovered with Toyota. The first ethical issue is the misrepresentation of Toyota's brand protection. Part of your vision statement says to make ever better cars to build a future where everyone has the freedom to move. Now, when you were considering a future with mobility for everyone, I'm almost certain you did not want the car thieves to be a part of that group. Regarding your mission of providing reliable vehicles, Toyota has focused on the mechanical side of being reliable, such as long-lasting engines or brakes, but has forgotten there are security components like anti-theft systems, which consumers rely on for their safety. Another portion to the misrepresentation of protection is your code of ethics. There are 4 sections that have been violated, which include providing safe products, developing technologies, disasters, and crime prevention. Lastly, theft stickers on your vehicle's windows have created a false sense of security that customers rely on to protect their vehicles by providing a vague statement about the vehicle's security. This leads to the second ethical issue, which involves Toyota not meeting their self-imposed fiduciary duty. As you acknowledged yesterday, you have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders, but due to the new code of conduct that you established in 2020, you now have a fiduciary duty to your customers, and it is this duty that is not being met. As a reminder, the Toyota Way highlights that your purpose is to put your customers first. You are only meeting the minimum standards of regulation, which translates to the lack of concern you have for your customer safety. These customers might not have a complete knowledge of what an anti-theft system does or how well it is supposed to perform, further showing how important it is for Toyota to provide transparency. These high thefts caused by the lack of concern for customer safety can also create emotional or physical harm, which is a critical thing that Toyota should be ensuring does not happen to their customers. By not fulfilling their self-imposed fiduciary duty, Toyota places the burden on stakeholders with the emotional stress of losing a vehicle, injuries caused by theft to the owner of a car or innocent bystanders, along with the increase of insurance premiums and potential tax increases due to the demand for police and crime prevention. The third ethical issue we discovered was that Toyota could be profiting from the misfortune of car theft. Once a car is stolen, the consumer may need a replacement car, which Toyota will benefit from. You could also benefit from aftermarket safety systems and repairs needed due to a reckless driver who stole the car. Out of all the ways Toyota can profit from the misfortune of theft, replacement is amongst the most expensive option. For example, the most stolen vehicles for Toyota in the US in 2020 included the Camry and Corolla. Over 2,000 were stolen, and if every model was replaced, the profit for Toyota would be over $63 million, further proving it is essential that Toyota address these ethical problems.
The ethical dilemma that your company faces has significant legal and financial impact if left unresolved. When it comes to the legal area, there are no immediate legal repercussions as your vehicles are currently meeting legal standards. However, we do know that the legal standards set a much lower bar than the ethical standards that your company should be striving for. We can also see that consumer groups are starting to demand action around this issue, and as well are starting to pressure local legislators. So, using foresight, it is only a matter of time before lawsuits are likely. We have also seen this before in your company's history with legal issues. The 2014 lawsuit dealing with your faulty accelerators resulted in just over $1.2 billion in settlements. We do believe that it is unlikely that this will occur with Toyota's anti-theft systems. However, it is something to be mindful of to prevent future problems. Just because there's currently no strong legal incentive to change does not mean that Toyota shouldn't still strive to be proactive and do what is right. When it comes to the financial repercussions of the ethical issues identified, we see that you're prioritizing short-term interests over long-term consequences, which will result in reputation risk, decreased sales, and reduced brand loyalty. Additionally, your workforce will lose faith in your employees if things do not change. We do not see these issues disappearing until you take direct internal action. The financial and legal ramifications that Toyota faces as a company are a result of the culture and value shift and must be addressed soon.
As mentioned by my colleague Ryan earlier, some of the key ethical issues surrounding your organization is the failure to meet their fiduciary duties to their consumer, the misrepresentation of Toyota's brand protection, and the fact that your company might be profiting off the misfortune from car theft. However, these issues are all symptoms of a deeper cultural issue within your organization, namely its failure to put the consumer's well-being first. With that being said, the first component of our solution is to focus on shifting the culture at Toyota. And that begins with you, the leadership team, announcing the organization's recommitment to living its values, followed by retraining employees on how to incorporate these values into their work moving forwards. And to further encourage employees to embrace this cultural shift, we recommend that you introduce initiatives to recognize those who go the extra mile in fulfilling Toyota's company values. And we also spoke about how focusing on encouraging responsible innovation within your organization can provide benefits. By introducing a responsible innovation checklist, it'll require innovation centers to ask itself whether its proposed projects are addressing consumer pain points and whether it's hurting other stakeholder groups. And in order to ensure that the organization is only committing to projects that serve the public's best interest. And finally, to further show its commitment to customer centricity, we recommend that Toyota work with national vehicle safety organizations to push for industry-wide change. By doing so, not only are you raising the standard for Toyota's theft prevention methods, but you're also positioning your organization as a change maker in its industry. And after calculating the costs to implement the shift to culture, push innovation, and change the industry solution, we found that it would be approximately $31 million. However, the positive impacts it'll have on your company's stakeholders and the goodwill that will come for Toyota's brand will help cement your position as a market leader for years to come. So in conclusion, we believe that by prioritizing consumer well-being in all aspects of Toyota's business, this will allow your company to be an ethical leader. By reaffirming Toyota's commitment to the customer, your organization ensures that the consumer is never overlooked in the interest of making a sale. And by encouraging ethical innovation through a customer-centric lens, Toyota makes the consumer's well-being the top priority, even when developing new technology. And by raising manufacturer responsibility for consumer well-being across the automotive industry, your company ensures the protection of consumer well-being in all areas of the auto industry. We thank you for joining us today as we discussed how your company can address the emerging issue of vehicle theft to retain your position as a market leader, as well as how you can encourage that customer welfare at the forefront of decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vision Consulting, and I need a few minutes. All right, thank you. If we could get back to the whole group together, that would be great. All right. Thank you all very much. This is not easy to do. Do you feel some relief that it's over? Well, you all did a good job and I appreciate it. It's not an easy thing to do. I want to make a couple of broad points and then I will do my best to pull out the highlights for each of you individually. Some of the overriding things that I think I need to bring up. Keep in mind when you do something like this, when you have only 10 minutes to talk about ethics. For all of you, there was a temptation to bring in other things, as if to set the stage, or as if to, I think one of you took 2 minutes before you actually began to get into the heart of what we really needed to hear, which is we wanted to know about just the ethics portion. Some of you segued into why that affected the legal or the financial, but it's difficult, and it happens a lot to teams that they spend time giving the bigger picture to try to explain the ethics, and what we're really asking for is the ethics only. Because if somebody brings you back and they only want to hear the ethics, that suggests that that's the part of the consulting solution that they just want to have more depth in. So this is a real chance to go back more into the depth of things. So I say that as a broad comment. As another comment, part of persuasion is the ability to talk directly to the audience. And it's really important that you not be reading from a script, or important that you not be relying on notes. There's a face-to-face thing that is really important to happen as it relates to the connection that you make with the person that you're trying to connect with. And I think the other piece of it is that it's really important not to be slow to getting to the ethics points, and to using as much depth as you can to make sure that a CEO or a management team really, or a board of directors really understands. So that's just for you to think about in terms of having the confidence to really just spend time making sure that every point you make is ethics first. And if you bring in something else, that it's justified by the ethics. All right. So I want to just check on something before excuse me a minute, before I. So Jacob and Jackie were the two that were WestPoint. You did a nice job of handing things off to each other. Jackie, your key point about investing more in Cameroon, I think, was an important one. I would have liked to have heard a little bit more detail, but I think that's a really good way to ground people in, people meaning who you're talking to, into what's important. I think that the points that you made, Jacob, about incorporating local partners and the independent ombudsman are really good points. I would have liked to have heard more about the ombudsman role. I think that's a really interesting kind of dynamic. And time in the beginning that you spent on the bigger picture, I understand it's a real temptation, but this is where, when you've got really good ideas, it's important to just really flesh them out for the group. The same is true with regaining trust. That's a really tough subject to talk about in 10 minutes, let alone, you know, the minutes that you have. You brought up the new values. It would have been nice to be clearer from my standpoint on what those values were. But that was a really good point. And what we know is that that kind of thing drives it. I think you handled this well. And I think that thinking about the use of time to really dwell more into what you really want someone to understand unequivocally would be helpful. Any questions about that?
Thank you for the feedback. And in particular, like you think on the like prioritizing the key points that we want to communicate with less emphasis on background. We were a little concerned just because we're talking about like Cameroon, and especially from the meeting yesterday, people were reflecting on not having a great working knowledge of Cameroon. Do you think that should like affect, I don't know if we participate in this next year, like choice of subject, or should we just, you know, push through and like trust that people don't really need to know that like Cameroon has 2 civil wars going on?
You know, that's a really good point, Jacob. And I think that it's a balance, and you did a little bit of that, which I think is helpful. Yeah, it's a very important statement to say something like invest more in Cameroon. It would be helpful if you do something complicated, that you pick one point that you're really comfortable with about what the investment might be that would apply to the ethics. Because you can't be expected, with all the research that I'm sure you all did, you can't be expected to be a definitive, you know, source. You're not majoring in in Cameroon. But it's helpful to give to what's really valuable about this is pulling it all down, not to the bigger picture, but to how you give some facts that help somebody listening to understand why, okay, it really is important that this be done. And to the point of, if you're dealing with a really complicated subject that you're initially attracted to in potentially coming up when you do it again next year, you do want to look for some safeguards for yourself in terms of, can we make a compelling case about something that's really this complicated? Or can we take an angle of that and make that compelling enough that that's enough of a sale of, yes, this ethical issue really needs to be addressed? Does that help at all?
Yes, thank you, ma'am.
I mean, there's no perfect here. You're, on one hand, you're commended, you meaning the entire, 14 teams, you're commended for picking challenging subjects. Because if you pick simple subjects, then you don't have a lot to work with and you can sound brilliant, but it doesn't mean that you're really moving the needle very much. So I think you find it, and that's why that's why a lot of teams start earlier, because they want to make sure that they've got, I don't mean earlier than you, I have no idea when you started, but I'm just saying that one of the things is that we look for, how can you get really comfortable with your material, and how can a difficult problem be broken down if it can, so that early on, if you find this is really too generic, you need to do something smaller, you've got the time to do that. But I think you handled it well. I think that you could have, what I was not hoping, but what would have made it easier to be focused on more ethics, if you kind of went a little bit more into some of the details. For example, are there 2 ideas for regaining trust that you wanted to move into? Is there one idea for investing in Cameroon? Is there an example that you may have read somewhere else about how local partners are being pulled in, and you might want to use that as a model that suggests that the company look at such and such who did such and such? So that gets you out of having to go into deep dialogue. And this is just my opinion. So I don't want to say that I'm setting definitive things, but just to get you thinking about getting deeper into your ideas. And that's really something that all of us need to do. And in each of the presentations, there were times I wish that if it was a really important point, that you gave us a little bit more substantiation. Just because your goal is to get someone to understand how serious this is and why they need to change. Make sense? Anything else? Congratulations, but anything else you want to ask? Okay, thank you very much for what you did. And I love the name SANE. I mean, it's not spelled SANE, but I thought it was great as a name. All right, Fordham Consulting Group, you were next. And let's see. This is hard for Uber judges. I want you to know the brain can only handle so much information at a time. And to get three of you is a gift, but it also means that you need to be on top of it. I thought that it was concise. You did repeat information that you might have used more time on just the ethics to set the stage. Again, all of us need to realize when we do this in the future that for the 10-minute, it's only about the ethical issue and the solution, and the context is just, you know, too bad for a judge who may not know the whole context. They're zeroing in on just the ethics. The precision with which you gave statistics about the impact to the low income, the 30%, the shock to the oil market, the welfare of low income people, I thought was a very good point. So also would have been the point that this would have affected the entire transportation structure on the East Coast. And that would mean buses and trains and planes, and it would affect how business operates as well as how people deal with personal crises of needing to be places or just their regular job. So that piece of it would also have helped broaden the larger impact that you, again, you talked big picture about America, which was very true. I mean, I think that that was important, but taking it to many levels, not just, there's an ethical impact on people who are wealthy, who no longer can, you know, who lose their business because in a month's time or whatever. So small point, but the 30% is a compelling figure to think about the drop in people's income if they're already low income. I liked how you talked about the you didn't just give us the one side of why you should do it. I liked some of the comments that you made about the discomfort in paying criminals. I think that was useful. There was a tendency to bring in money a lot, and it's hard to make money ethical. And that's probably natural based on how we do view things in the bigger picture. But in something like this, it's really important to stick to the human and make sure that the financial is always, you know, not something that's a standalone statement about somebody's financial. I can't remember. My handwriting is so brilliant, but there was one point you made about finances that you could have made sound, you could have brought it more into an ethical issue, but the language didn't continue. And so somebody could look at that and say, that isn't ethical. It is. You were right about your point, but it needed to not be taken for granted. Let's see. I thought your summation of the points that were there were the tangible threats to stakeholders, as well as how you enumerated each level being affected, I thought was helpful. So you did address both sides of the dilemma, which I liked. I would have liked, I think, also more information on how harm was being averted by what you did. Because you have a compelling, you set things up, and I'm being as critical as possible simply because I see that this is an important kind of thing that didn't make what you did bad or good. It just raised questions for all of the teams about how can you get more into the material to create the outcome that you want, which is you want the person that the CEO that you're talking to unequivocally feel comfortable with the decision. So any questions from any of that? Anything you want to ask me related to it?
No, I think we're good. Just thank you again for all this consideration. It's just been such a pleasure to be here and compete. So,
well, I think the topic you took, as did the topic that WestPoint took, I think these are all three of the topics are really important ones, and they get to the heart of a lot of ethical issues. So it's important for me to try to think of all the ways I can think of to get that sort of percolating in you, because hopefully all of you will go forth from IBEC with a recognition of how ethics shows up in so many things, that we look at the over issue, but not necessarily the depth of the implications. And so if your training and your work for the last, several weeks, whatever, on this is hopefully a spin-off to the kinds of things that you'll be, as a group, much more sensitive to. So again, thank you very much, Fordham Consulting Group. And now we'll talk about vision consulting. You guys are still here? Excellent. All right. I think that it was a good topic. It raised interesting issues that I think needed to be addressed. The challenge of failing to stop theft is a big one. That's not an easy, here are two things you can do and it's over. So it was important, to hear that you had some additional points. The points about the misrepresentation of brand protection, you did spend good time with, and I think that's important. I don't know if there was more that you could have said, but I think that the misrepresentation was clearly significant. When you talked about fiduciary duty, your next point was purpose, to put the customers first, and I'm wondering if there was a way to, you might have had a statement that talked about the interchangeability of ethics and fiduciary duty at the beginning, so that anybody thinking that you were, talking about money for the sake of just talking about that would immediately understand that you had tied those two together. Does that make sense? Because I think it's easy to feel that you were going back into the main proposal, but I think that it was a key point and could have been couched a little bit more toward the harm and the lack of transparency. The points you made under it were all very significant and very impactful to ethics, but fiduciary responsibility is often seen by others as something else. The profiting of the car theft was a really interesting point, and I almost wondered why you made that the third point. Obviously, it's important. I mean, all of these points were important, but that would have been a great place to have some repeating of the values of Toyota and understanding how that was perhaps potentially undermining what they say, who they are. I don't know the values of Toyota, but that there could be a blowback of something like that is a huge undermining of their credibility. And so that point might have had a little bit more leg under it. I like the point of the legal standards lower are a lower bar than the ethical standards. You probably gave more information than that in the overall performance, but I think that was enough to let me know that you were tying it in a way, but then didn't stop. You spent some time on the lawsuit likelihood, which was fine, but if in fact there was more that you could have said about some of the other ethical issues, the lawsuit is more about what the good point was, that no legal incentive to do what's right, and that was a valuable thing. Part of it is just thinking about how the information that you all have is put together in a way that is consistently focused on an ethical argument that persuades. And so the choices that you make are useful in trying to be the most significant ones to get someone's attention to understand what they really have to do in order to comply with being what they think they are sufficiently ethical. I liked the idea a lot about the national vehicle safety, but I didn't know how that would play out. I didn't know really, how that would, there wasn't a lot of information about that. So that was a good idea, but I didn't know what it would really ultimately mean. I think you did a very good job. But it's my job to pull up the things that I want you to think about as you do this again, hopefully next year in something else, or that you do it if I haven't looked to see if you're all graduating, but are you graduating next year? So for those who are, you're going into I hate to say the real world. You're going into a business environment where hopefully what you've learned through your work with IBEC makes you much more sensitive, if that makes any sense. Any questions you want to ask me about what I said or about the program or whatever?
I think one question I did have was whether, did we focus too heavily on explaining the background of our solutions? That was kind of my concern, that we spend too much time on that.
I didn't put down the minutes. I tried to do that for everyone, but when you're only talking about 10 minutes, you're really talking about what seems like a lot of time that isn't at all. When you think about the points that you have and you think about how you want to frame it from the beginning, you really need to allow enough time to do that. So I think that any time that's spent on the bigger picture or trying to, and it is human nature to think that I need to give you background about the whole thing before I go into the heart of what we're talking about, but we just don't have time for that. So I think that all of the teams spent time that they could have reinvested into bolstering the points, because the more information you have, the easier it is to persuade someone.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
No, that
And
makes sense.
with ethics, we often have to persuade people about what they're not seeing that has other implications, that whether it's trustworthiness or whatever, that they may not realize, they may not be drawing the, connecting the dots, I guess is the best way to say it.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Okay, well, congratulations on what you did. And the only other advice I have is that for the 90-second, for those of you who are participating in it, it's really important to follow the directions and to focus exactly on what was asked, because 90 seconds is not a lot of time. And so you have compelling up, whoever is doing it, you have a compelling opportunity to be in a role that you are projecting what we hope will be a real life situation when you are working in a company and something comes up and no one's talking about it. And that's the whole point of the leadership that I hope each of you take on, you know, in your lives, that this subject is not just for the classroom or for those of us who happen to love it and work in it. It's for all of us. And so the practice is hopefully, you know, one that you'll be comfortable doing. I mean, who doesn't want to play a role? You know, who doesn't want to be a star for 90 seconds, right? Thank you all very much. If there's nothing else, you can just enjoy the day. And again, feel good about yourselves. Thank you. You did a good job.
Have a great rest of your Friday, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for doing
Thank
the
you,
Thank you
ma'am.
all.